The wind howled across the desolate landscape, twisting and howling through the barren trees that stood like specters in the dim light of a cold March afternoon. The snow had been falling for days, and the heavy blanket of white that covered the countryside seemed to absorb all sound, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The Hinterkaifeck farm, isolated in the remote German countryside, sat eerily still, the lone building standing in defiance against the storm. Andreas Gruber stood by the barn, his thick woolen coat pressed tightly against his body as he watched the swirling snowflakes dance through the air. His breath clouded in front of him, freezing in the bitter wind. He felt uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. It wasn't unusual for snowstorms to batter the farm, but today felt different. The wind seemed to carry with it an unsettling presence, something that brushed against his skin and whispered to him from the darkness. He turned to face the farmhouse, where his wife, Chesalia, would be preparing dinner. Their daughter, Victoria, and her 2 children, little Joseph and Chesalia Jr., would be inside as well, warm and safe. But even though the family was together, something gnawed at him. Lately he had been hearing things, strange noises, late-at-night noises that didn't belong. At first, it had been the sounds of something moving in the attic. Then came the odd footsteps in the snow outside, appearing overnight as if someone had been watching the house, silently observing from the darkness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He knew better than to ignore a feeling like this. It wasn't just paranoia, it was instinct, and something inside told him that his instinct was right. They were being watched. The thought of it sent a chill through him that no amount of winter cold could replicate. He had tried to speak to the local authorities about the strange occurrences, but they dismissed him as just another old man making up stories. No one believed him, and that only made him feel more isolated, more vulnerable. As he turned to head back to the farmhouse, something caught his eye, something out of place. A set of footprints in the snow, fresh and unbroken, leading toward the barn. But they didn't belong to anyone in his family. He froze in place, his heart skipping a beat. The prints were too large to belong to his wife or children, and they were too deep, as though someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. His mind raced. Had someone been hiding out here in the woods? Was there someone on the property? He could feel the blood rush to his ears, the pounding of his heartbeat drowning out everything else. He quickly approached the footprints, his boots crunching in the snow with each step. He knew the farm like the back of his hand. There was no sign of any animals, nothing that could have made these tracks. He dropped to one knee and examined them more closely. The deep impressions left in the snow were unmistakable. They were fresh. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew the land, knew how to move quietly in the night. As Andreas looked up, scanning the surrounding woods, a sudden, sickening realization washed over him. The farm was no longer just his. Someone had been here, watching them, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Without thinking, he stood up and hurried back to the farmhouse, his boots leaving deep imprints in the snow as he rushed to warn his family. The unease inside him had turned into a knot of terror, something primal and raw. He pushed open the door to the house with a force that made the wood groan. Chesalia, Victoria, and the children looked up from the fire, startled by his sudden entrance. "Papa, what is it?" Victoria asked, concern flickering in her eyes. Andreas' voice was tight with fear, his breath coming in short, quick gasps. "There's someone here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone has been watching the house. I saw their tracks. They're fresh, leading to the barn." Victoria's face paled, and even Chesalia, usually the calm one in their family, felt her stomach tighten. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth, but it did little to warm the chill that had settled in their hearts. They locked the doors and checked the windows, but the sense of dread lingered, heavier than the snow outside. The silence that had descended over the house was unbearable. No one spoke for a long while. The only sound was the wind howling outside, scraping at the walls of the farmhouse. Andreas couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for them in the darkness. He stood in the doorway, his eyes darting nervously between the shadows and the snow-covered woods outside. The feeling of being watched had never been more real. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, a soft rapping at the door, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. Without thinking, Victoria moved toward the door. Who could it be? She asked nervously, her hand hovering over the handle. Andreas stopped her with a sharp glance. "Don't open it." But Victoria didn't listen. She reached for the door, pulling it open just a crack. Standing on the other side was a man, tall and cloaked in a heavy coat that shielded most of his face. His eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto hers. "Are you lost?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm looking for shelter," he said. "It's cold out here. May I come inside?" Victoria hesitated, the words on the tip of her tongue. She glanced back at her father, who was standing rigidly in the corner, his eyes never leaving the stranger. Before she could answer, the man spoke again, his voice now more insistent. "I mean no harm," he said. "I'm just passing through." Something about his presence was unnerving, and though it wasn't an answer that satisfied her, she stepped back, allowing him to enter. As the man crossed the threshold, the room seemed to grow darker. The fire in the hearth seemed to flicker with uncertainty, casting strange shadows along the walls. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them all in the same room. Andreas stood motionless, his gaze locked on the man. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. The man paused, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the family with a cold detachment. "Just someone in need of shelter," he replied, his tone never changing. But the unease that settled over the Grubers only deepened. There was something wrong about this man, something that didn't belong. The man who had entered their home had brought with him more than just a chill. His presence hung over the Grubers like a thick fog, settling into every crevice of the farmhouse, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. He was still standing in the middle of the room, his tall frame almost blocking the warmth from the hearth. The fire crackled and popped, but it did little to dispel the unease that had taken root in the hearts of the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber's eyes never left the stranger as he took a slow, deliberate step toward the fire. The man's face was shadowed beneath the hood of his cloak, but his eyes cold, calculating glinted from beneath it. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things, who had done things that could never be undone. The man spoke again, his voice low and almost mechanical. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, though there was no sincerity in his tone. "I've been walking for hours. I need to rest." Victoria stood frozen, her hand hovering over her chest as though she could feel the beating of her heart in her throat. She looked at her father, but his face was unreadable, his jaw set in a firm line. Cecilia, her mother, remained silent, her eyes flickering between the stranger and her husband. Despite his words, the man's demeanor did not match his claim of harmlessness. He stood too still, too calm, his movements measured and deliberate. "Where did you come from?" Andreas asked, his voice strained. His suspicion was thick in the air, palpable like a storm about to break. He took a step forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between himself and the stranger. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he seemed to study Andreas, as if weighing whether the answer was worth giving. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "From the woods," he finally said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I was traveling, lost my way. There's no one else around. I saw the light from your windows, so I thought I might find shelter." Andreas stared at him, unblinking, and nodded slowly. The stranger's story didn't add up. The weather had been harsh, and the roads were barely visible, let alone passable for someone traveling on foot. If the man had been out in the cold, he would have been half frozen, not standing there as if he had just taken a casual stroll. "Are you alone?" Victoria asked, her voice a little too sharp, betraying her nerves. The stranger's eyes flicked toward her, cold and emotionless. "I'm alone," he said. His words were simple, yet there was something almost cryptic about them. Andreas, still suspicious, looked the man up and down. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, his gaze flickering momentarily toward the shadows in the corner of the room. "Call me Carl," he finally said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "That's all you need to know." Carl, the stranger, moved toward the table, his long coat trailing behind him. He reached for a chair, his hand brushing over the surface as though he were carefully choosing his next move. His gaze didn't leave the family as he sat, and the tension in the room grew heavier. Victoria moved to the hearth, trying to focus on the fire, but her thoughts were all over the place. Who was this man? Why was he here? The questions swirled in her mind, but none of them seemed to make sense. The stranger's presence was an intrusion, and yet it felt like something far worse was approaching. "Can we offer you something to eat?" Chesalia asked, her voice quiet but steady, though her eyes betrayed the fear she tried to hide. She moved toward the kitchen area, her hands shaking as she prepared a small meal. Carl didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His eyes swept over the room again, taking in every detail. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at everything, as though he were cataloging it all for some unknown reason. The wind howled outside, the sound muffled by the thick walls of the farmhouse. But inside, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the stranger had sucked all the warmth from the room. "I'm not hungry," Carl said finally, his voice low and distant. "I'm just here for the night. Tomorrow, I'll be on my way." His words hung in the air, but no one responded. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Andreas cleared his throat and gestured toward the window, where the snowstorm had picked up again. "You're welcome to stay, but I'd suggest you leave before morning. The storm is getting worse, and it's unsafe to travel." Carl's lips twitched into something that almost resembled a smile, though it was hard to tell under the shadow of his hood. "I'm not worried," he said, his tone as cold as the snow outside. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around them. The fire crackled as though it too felt the unease. As the night wore on, the family members exchanged few words. No one could shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the storm, it was him. After a long silence, Andreas stood up, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice firm but strained. "You'll need it for your journey." Carl simply nodded, as though he had expected this. He stood up slowly, pushing the chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. "Thank you," he said, though the words seemed to carry no true gratitude. He turned and walked toward the corner of the room where the family's bedding lay. But before he lay down, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. The moment his eyes met Andreas's, the tension in the room doubled. It was as though the stranger could see straight into his soul. For a brief moment, Andreas thought he saw a flicker of malice, something dark behind those cold eyes. And then Karl turned, and the moment passed. The Grubers tried to sleep, but the night stretched on like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were listening. Around midnight, Andreas heard footsteps above, in the attic. The same sound that had unsettled him before, the sound that had been echoing through the house for weeks now. But tonight, it was different. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was up there, and it wasn't just the storm. The hours stretched long into the night. The wind outside howled louder, like a living thing, pressing against the farmhouse walls with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. It wasn't the kind of storm that could be ignored. It was the kind of storm that made you believe the earth itself was in turmoil, a signal that something awful was coming. Andreas Gruber lay in his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling above him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The footsteps in the attic, the sound that had started days ago, hadn't stopped. It wasn't the kind of noise an animal would make. It wasn't the wind. No, these were deliberate steps, calculated movements, like someone pacing slowly back and forth in the attic above their heads. But who and why? He shifted under the heavy blankets, trying to quiet the rising unease in his chest. He had heard the footsteps just before he lay down. The sound had stopped briefly, but then it started again, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. His mind raced. Could it be the stranger, Karl? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. What if Karl had been hiding something? What if he had been planning something all along? No, that wasn't possible. But the feeling that something terrible was about to happen was too overwhelming to ignore. And then, just as Andreas was about to slip into a restless sleep, he heard it again, a faint creak, as if something heavy had moved in the attic. The footsteps were louder now, more pronounced, as if whoever was up there was coming closer to the edge of the floor, closer to them. Andreas shot up in bed, his heart hammering in his chest. He could hear his wife Chesalia breathing softly beside him, unaware of the growing danger. He rose quietly, his bare feet padding softly against the cold wooden floor, and moved toward the door. He paused for a moment, straining his ears. The footsteps were unmistakable now. They were right above him. His pulse quickened. Something was not right. He opened the door to the hallway and stepped out into the darkened corridor, trying not to make a sound. The farmhouse was eerily silent, save for the persistent creaking above him. He crept toward the staircase that led to the attic, each step seeming louder than the last in the stillness. As he reached the top of the stairs, a faint smell of something sour and metallic filled the air, a smell that didn't belong, something strange and foreign. It made him stop dead in his tracks. The attic door was slightly ajar, and there, in the dim light from the hallway below, he could see the outline of something or someone moving around inside. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a shout. It was Victoria's voice. She screamed loud, and terrified her voice raw with panic. "Papa, help!" Without a second thought, Andreas bolted down the hall and towards Victoria's room, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He burst into her room, and the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Victoria was standing by the window, her face pale and wide-eyed, her hand pressed against her mouth to stifle a scream. The curtains fluttered in the wind that had blown in through the broken window. And there, in the middle of the room, was Carl, his face twisted into something far darker than before. His eyes were wide, but they didn't look human anymore. There was nothing alive in them. And in his hands, he held a long, gleaming knife. Victoria's scream was cut short as Carl lunged forward, his movements swift and unnatural. Andreas reacted instantly, his body propelled by adrenaline, his hands grasping for anything to defend his daughter, to protect his family. "Get away from her," he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. Carl didn't answer. Instead, his lips curled into a twisted smile, a cruel, knowing smile. His eyes, those cold, predatory eyes, locked onto Andreas with an intensity that chilled him to the bone. The knife in Carl's hand gleamed in the dim light as he swung it toward Andreas with terrifying precision. Andreas barely managed to dodge, feeling the blade graze his arm as it sliced through his sleeve. Pain shot through his body, but he pushed it aside. He had to protect his family. "Victoria, run!" Andreas shouted, trying to block Carl's next strike with his arm. But Carl was fast, too fast. The man had an unnatural strength, his movements too fluid, too deliberate. Victoria didn't hesitate. She turned and ran from the room, her feet pounding on the floor as she raced down the hallway to find her mother and the children. But Andreas was trapped, locked in a fight for his life. He stumbled backward, trying to regain his footing, but Carl was relentless. Each strike was faster than the last, and Andreas could feel the panic rising in his throat. He was no match for this man. He knew that now. Carl grinned as he advanced, his knife raised high. "Papa," Victoria's voice cried from the hallway, but there was no time to respond. Andreas was forced to leap back once more, but his foot caught on the edge of a chair, sending him crashing to the floor. Carl pounced. The blade came down with a sickening force, catching Andreas across the chest. Pain exploded through him like fire, and he gasped, blood filling his mouth. He barely had time to react before Carl was on top of him, pressing the blade down, driving it deeper. Victoria's scream echoed through the house, but everything around Andreas began to blur. He felt his strength draining, the darkness closing in around him. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The pressure on his chest released. His head felt heavy, his breath shallow. Through his hazy vision, he saw Carl standing above him, his face eerily calm, his knife dripping with blood. The stranger's eyes flickered to the door where Victoria had disappeared. And for a moment, Andreas saw something strange in them, a brief glimmer of recognition. Something almost human, but it was gone before he could make sense of it. Carl turned away from the dying man and walked slowly out of the room, his footsteps echoing as he moved down the hall toward the other members of the family. Andreas, barely conscious, fought against the darkness. He had to warn them. They had to escape, but it was too late. The storm outside was nothing compared to the nightmare that had entered their home. The house seemed to groan and shudder in the aftermath of the attack. Outside, the wind howled louder than ever, the storm's fury now an unrelenting force, battering against the walls of the farmhouse like the angry roar of some unseen monster. Inside, all was silent, save for the soft, labored breathing of the Grubers, each of them struggling to process the nightmare that had invaded their lives. Victoria stood frozen in the hallway, her mind in a fog, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. The sight of her father, Andreas, lying in a pool of his own blood, had shattered her. His body, once so strong, so reliable, was now a broken shell, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow gasps as he clung to life. She could hear his ragged breath from the hallway, the sound of it grating against her nerves, filling her with both dread and hopelessness. She had to act. There was no time to waste. The others, her mother, Cecilia, and the children, were still inside the house. They were still in danger. Her heart raced as she made her way toward the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was no sign of Carl. The man, or whatever he was gone. She had no idea where he had gone or what he planned to do next, but one thing was certain: he would not stop. Not until he had finished what he had started. "Cecilia," Victoria shouted, her voice breaking as she reached the top of the stairs. "Cecilia, we need to go now. We need to get out of here." She didn't wait for a response. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to act, to get as far away from the farmhouse as possible. She ran to her mother's room, her pulse pounding in her ears. The door was ajar, and Victoria burst through, finding Cecilia sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. The two children, Joseph and Cecilia Jr., were clinging to her, their small bodies trembling in fear. "Victoria, what's going on?" Cecilia asked, her voice shaky. "What's happened to Andreas?" "There's no time," Victoria said, her voice hoarse with panic. "Carl, he attacked Papa. We have to leave, now." Cecilia looked at her daughter with wide eyes, the horror of the situation settling in. She had heard the scream, the crash, but had been too afraid to move. The words didn't fully sink in until now. What do you mean, he attacked him?" Cecilia stammered, her eyes darting around the room. Who is he? What's happening?" Victoria swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't know, but we need to go. Carl, he's not who he says he is. He's going to kill us all if we stay here." The wind outside rattled the windows, and Cecilia's gaze flickered toward the window. For a moment, there was silence, a brief moment of hesitation. But then, her motherly instinct kicked in. She stood up, quickly gathering the children into her arms. "You're right. We can't stay here," Cecilia said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We'll go to the barn. The animals are still in there. We can hide with them. It's better than staying in the house." Victoria nodded, her eyes already scanning the room for anything they could take with them. The storm was so fierce now that they couldn't risk leaving through the front door. The barn would offer some shelter, some safety until they figured out what to do next. She grabbed a coat and pulled it on quickly, her hands trembling with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her mind raced, but the only thought that kept repeating was that they had to leave, that they had to escape before it was too late. "Cecilia, take the children and go to the barn. I'll check on Papa," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the panic surging through her chest. "Hurry." Cecilia's face hardened with determination. "Be quick. Don't take too long. We need to stick together." Victoria nodded. She didn't know how much longer her father could hold on. She didn't know how much longer they could hold on. But they had to try. They had to survive. Cecilia led the children to the door, her face pale, her eyes wild with fear. She stepped out into the darkened hallway, and Victoria followed, her gaze shifting nervously back toward the stairs. She knew what she had to do. She had to get her father out of there, get him to safety. But every second that passed was one they didn't have. Victoria crept down the stairs, the quiet of the house suffocating in its intensity. She could hear the wind howling outside, the storm battering against the windows. But what she didn't hear, what she feared most, was the sound of footsteps. There was no sign of Carl. The house was silent. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard the faint sound of her father's labored breathing from the other room. She rushed toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. He was still alive, but barely. Andreas was slumped on the floor, his blood staining the wooden floorboards around him. His face was pale, his eyes closed, but he was breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, painful gasps. "Papa, wake up," Victoria whispered, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Papa, we have to go. We have to get out of here." For a long moment, there was no response. Victoria felt a cold, nauseating wave of dread wash over her. What if it was too late? What if he couldn't be saved? But then, just as she was about to give up, she felt his hand twitch. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her, his gaze distant, his expression pained but alert. "Victoria," he rasped, his voice hoarse and weak. "Get out of here. Leave, now." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She couldn't afford to break down now. "Papa, I won't leave you. You have to come with me. We have to get out of here before he comes back." Andreas looked at her, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and love. You have to go. He's not human, he's something else." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew what he meant the way Carl had looked at them, the coldness in his eyes. It wasn't just the attack, it was something more. But Victoria didn't have time to process it. She had to move. "Papa, please, just hold on. We're leaving," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Victoria took hold of her father's arm and carefully helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he leaned on her. They moved toward the back door, toward the barn, toward whatever semblance of safety they could find in the storm. But just as they reached the door, the sound of footsteps echoed from the darkened hallway behind them. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was Carl, his eyes glowing in the dim light. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice cold and mocking. "You should have stayed." And then he stepped forward. The door creaked open with an unsettling sound, as though it were mourning what was about to transpire. The wind howled louder outside, but inside, the house was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Carl stood in the doorway, his tall figure framed by the storm raging outside. His silhouette seemed to flicker in the dim light, his eyes gleaming with a strange, predatory intensity. Victoria froze. The moment she had feared was now before her, and all the air seemed to vanish from the room. She could feel the weight of her father's body leaning against her, his breath still shallow, but he was clinging to life, barely. She could feel his weight, but she could also feel the cold sweat on his skin, the tension in his muscles. He was trying, desperately, to stay alive for her. Carl's lips curled into a twisted smile, one that seemed to widen in the shadows of the doorway. His eyes didn't blink. "You think you can escape?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, though it was thick with malice. His words carried an edge, as though each syllable were carefully calculated. Victoria swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her mind raced as she tried to find a way out of this nightmare. She couldn't fight him. She knew that. He was stronger, faster. There was no chance of overpowering him. But she had to try. "Stay back," Victoria yelled, trying to sound confident, though her voice cracked with fear. She held her father up as best as she could, her body trembling with the effort. "We're leaving. We're not staying here with you." Carl's laugh was cold, chilling. "You think you can leave? You think you can run from me?" Victoria's eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use, but the house was quiet and barren. The storm outside howled louder, and her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't back down, she couldn't give up. But Carl wasn't backing down either. He stepped forward, and with each movement, it felt as though the house itself shrank away from him, as though the walls recoiled in fear. He was not just a man, he was something darker, something more malevolent. He moved with a predator's grace, unhurried, enjoying every moment of the fear he instilled. "I told you," Carl said, his voice low and menacing. "There is nowhere to hide. I know this house better than you. I know every inch of it. You won't escape." Victoria's hand flew to her side, searching for something, anything to defend herself with. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the old iron poker near the hearth. She gripped it tightly, its weight reassuring in her hand. Carl stopped in his tracks, his eyes flicking toward the poker, then back to her. His smile didn't falter. "You think that will save you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though the idea of her trying to defend herself was laughable. He took another step closer. Victoria tightened her grip on the poker, trying to steady her breath. "Stay away from us," she said again, but her voice wavered, betraying her fear. Carl stopped just a few feet away from her, the tension in the room thickening with every second. For a long moment, there was silence, just the steady pounding of the wind outside and the sound of Victoria's breath, coming in shallow gasps. And then, without warning, Carl lunged. The world seemed to explode around Victoria. She barely had time to react, the poker swinging toward Carl in a desperate attempt to keep him away. But he was too fast. He caught her wrist in midair, his grip like iron, his fingers digging into her skin with a crushing force. Victoria gasped in pain, but she refused to let go. She twisted her body, pulling with all her strength, trying to break free. But Carl's grip only tightened. "You're foolish," Carl growled, his voice a low, menacing rasp. "You cannot fight me. You are nothing." Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts racing. She couldn't give in. She couldn't let him win. With a surge of desperation, Victoria kicked out, her foot connecting with Carl's shin. He stumbled back for just a moment, giving her the briefest of openings. She didn't hesitate. Using every ounce of strength left in her, she swung the poker upward with all her might. The metal connected with Carl's face with a sickening crack. For a moment, his expression faltered, a flash of surprise crossing his features. Blood spurted from his nose, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Victoria didn't wait. She shoved her father toward the door and sprinted toward the barn, her heart thundering in her chest. She had to get out of there. She had to escape. Behind her, Carl's voice rang out, cold and full of rage. "You can run, but you can't hide." Victoria burst through the door, the wind and snow lashing at her face. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She had to keep moving. The barn was just ahead, a dark silhouette in the distance. Her father was stumbling behind her, struggling to keep up. But Victoria could hear his labored breathing, could see the way he was struggling to remain standing. The bleeding had not stopped. He was weak. They didn't have much time. Victoria reached the barn and threw open the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled her father inside and slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with a trembling hand. Inside, the barn was dark and cold, the animals stirring in the stalls, startled by the sudden noise. Victoria rushed toward the hayloft, helping her father climb the ladder to the small platform above. The higher ground would give them some protection. But as they reached the top, she realized something that froze her blood. The barn door creaked. Carl was here. Victoria's eyes darted toward the shadows in the corner, her mind racing. She knew they were running out of time. The wind outside howled again, but the barn seemed even quieter now, as though it too were waiting for something. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel him out there. She could feel his presence creeping closer, like a shadow stalking her every move. And then the door swung open. Carl stepped into the barn, his face streaked with blood. His eyes gleamed with fury. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just an escape. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a final confrontation. The barn door creaked open, and in the dim light of the storm, Carl stood silhouetted in the doorway. His face was streaked with blood, his once calm demeanor now replaced by something darker, more primal. His eyes, wild and intense, locked onto Victoria and her father. Victoria's heart thundered in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, suffocating her with its urgency. There was no more room for hesitation, no more time to wonder about what Carl truly was. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Her father, Andreas, was slumped beside her, his breathing shallow and labored, blood staining the front of his clothes. He looked pale, close to death, and his eyes were unfocused, barely registering what was happening around him. But Victoria couldn't afford to let that slow her down. She needed him to stay conscious. They needed to make it through this together. Victoria gripped the iron poker tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. The tool, which had once seemed like nothing more than a mundane object, was now her lifeline. She wasn't sure it would be enough, but she had no choice but to fight. Carl stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He had all the time in the world, it seemed. He didn't need to hurry. He had already won so many battles. The attack on her father, the psychological torment, the fear he had instilled in her family was like a poison now, seeping through every crevice of the farmhouse. "You think you can stop me with that?" Carl's voice was a low, mocking growl, his smile crooked and sinister. He stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "You can't even protect yourselves. You're nothing." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. His words cut deep, but she couldn't let them weaken her. She had to stay strong, for her father, for her family. "Stay away from us," Victoria said, her voice shaking but firm. She raised the poker slightly, ready to strike if she had to. Carl chuckled, his voice full of twisted amusement. "You're going to die here, just like the rest of them. You can't run from me. You can't hide." The wind outside howled louder, a fierce storm lashing against the barn. The sound of the storm, the creaking of the barn's old wood, and the oppressive silence between them seemed to stretch out for eternity. Victoria could hear her pulse in her ears, the only other sound that filled the air. Carl stepped forward again, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous barn. He was close, now too close. His eyes were locked on Victoria, and she could feel the weight of his gaze, like it was pressing down on her. Her father stirred beside her, trying to rise, but the pain was evident on his face. He could barely stay upright. His body was failing him. "Papa," Victoria whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Stay with me, please." Andreas' eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her, his face twisted with pain, but still full of determination. Get away from here. Victoria, he's not human. He's... His voice trailed off, too weak to finish the sentence. But Victoria understood. She had always known Carl wasn't just a man. There was something wrong about him, something dark, something unnatural. But there was no more time to think. Carl was right there. Victoria's heart pounded harder, and before she could stop herself, she lunged forward, swinging the poker at Carl with all her strength. But Carl was faster. In a blur of movement, he dodged to the side, his arm reaching out to grab her wrist before she could land the blow. His grip was crushing, cold as ice, and she could feel the strength in his fingers as they dug into her flesh. "You can't fight me, Victoria," he said, his voice calm and steady, almost affectionate in its malice. "You're weak, you're afraid, and that's why you'll never win." Victoria gritted her teeth, refusing to show any fear. She twisted her wrist, trying to break free from his hold, but it was no use. His grip was unrelenting. Then, in a moment of clarity, Victoria did the only thing she could think of. She swung the poker in the opposite direction, aiming for Carl's face. This time, she didn't miss. The metal of the poker collided with his jaw with a sickening crack. He staggered back, the force of the blow enough to knock him off balance. His head snapped to the side, but his eyes remained focused on her, unblinking, unafraid. "Impressive," Carl said, wiping a thin line of blood from his lips. "But it won't be enough." With a speed that defied reason, Carl lunged again, his hand grabbing her throat and lifting her off the ground. Her feet kicked helplessly in the air as he squeezed tighter, cutting off her breath. "Victoria," her father gasped, trying to move toward them. But he was too weak, his body too battered to fight back. Victoria's vision blurred, her mind growing foggy as Carl's grip tightened. She could feel her consciousness slipping away, the world growing darker by the second. Her chest was on fire, her lungs burning for air. But then, out of nowhere, something changed. A loud crash echoed from behind her, followed by a grunt. Carl's grip loosened for just a moment, and Victoria's head spun as she gasped for air. She turned her head and saw her father, his face twisted with pain. But his hand had grabbed a loose pitchfork from the nearby pile of hay. He had used it to strike Carl. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough to stop him, but it was enough to distract him for a split second. Victoria's body hit the floor as Carl released her, and she gasped for breath, her hands clutching her throat, trying to steady herself. Her father had bought her a moment. "Papa," she cried, crawling toward him, but Carl was already recovering. His eyes burned with fury as he turned back toward them, the twisted smile never leaving his face. Victoria could see it now, the way Carl's movements were so fluid, so unnatural. He was faster than any man she had ever seen, and his strength was terrifying. He wasn't just human, he couldn't be. Her heart sank as she realized the truth. They weren't going to make it. No matter what they did, they wouldn't survive. But in the deepest corner of her mind, a thought flickered one last chance. Victoria reached behind her, grabbing a sharp piece of broken wood that had fallen during the chaos. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With one last burst of adrenaline, Victoria scrambled to her feet, her body aching, her throat raw. She couldn't back down now. She couldn't die like this, not after everything they had been through. With a scream, she hurled the broken piece of wood toward Carl's heart. Carl's eyes went wide, but he didn't move. The wood slammed into his chest, but instead of crumpling, he just stood there. The wood had pierced his skin, but he was still standing. And in that moment, Victoria knew there was no hope. Carl took a step forward. The barn felt as though it was closing in on Victoria. The wind howled louder, as if mocking their struggle, the storm outside shaking the very foundations of the building. Her pulse raced, every breath a desperate gasp for air. Her father, weakened and bloodied, was barely able to hold himself up as he staggered toward her. But it was clear that they were running out of time. Every second was a precious gift that Carl was willing to take from them, piece by piece. Carl's face twisted into an expression of dark amusement. He stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate, as though savoring each moment. He was toying with them, the way a cat might toy with its prey before delivering the final, fatal blow. Victoria could feel the weight of her own helplessness bearing down on her. They were outmatched, outgunned, in every sense of the word. Carl wasn't just a man. He wasn't even human. She had seen it in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the unnatural, almost inhuman way he had shrugged off their attacks. He was something else, something ancient, something dark, and something that had been hunting them for far too long. But as she looked at her father, struggling to stay upright beside her, something inside her hardened. No more fear, no more hesitation. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending it, all stopping Carl from continuing his reign of terror. Carl's lips curled into that twisted smile, as though reading her thoughts. He stepped closer, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice eerily calm, like a snake's hiss. "You've been running from me your whole lives. You think you can stand up to me now? You're nothing. You can't fight what I am." Victoria shook her head, her grip tightening around the makeshift weapon in her hand, a jagged piece of wood, splintered and uneven, but still sharp. It was all she had. She wasn't going to let him take everything from her. "Then why are you afraid?" she whispered, her voice trembling, but her resolve steady. Carl's smile faltered for a moment, the smallest crack in his otherwise impenetrable mask. Then, with a low growl, he lunged forward with frightening speed. Victoria barely had time to react. She swung the wooden shard at him with all her strength, aiming for his throat. But once again, he was too fast. He grabbed her wrist in midair, crushing it with one hand, the jagged edge of the wood scraping harmlessly against his skin. The pain shot through her arm like fire, and she cried out, but Carl didn't seem to care. "You think this little piece of wood is going to save you?" he sneered, his grip tightening. With a sudden, brutal twist, Carl wrenched the shard from her hand and tossed it aside, as though it were nothing more than an annoying toy. He looked down at her with contempt. Victoria gasped, her hand now bleeding from the force of his grip. But she didn't give up. She couldn't. Her father was still standing behind her, but she could see that his strength was waning. They had no more chances. This was it. Carl raised his hand as if to strike, and in that instant, Victoria knew she had one final choice. She turned to her father, who was now crouched on the ground, gasping for air. His face was pale, and the blood had seeped through his clothes. He wasn't going to make it much longer. Victoria could see it in his eyes, the silent apology, the acceptance of their fate, but not hers. With a frantic, desperate cry, Victoria lunged at Carl one last time. She aimed for his heart. The jagged piece of wood now, slick with blood from her own hand, sank deep into his chest, just below his ribs. Carl's eyes widened in surprise, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to falter. But even as the wood buried itself in his chest, Victoria realized that it didn't stop him. It didn't kill him. It wasn't enough. He reached down and yanked the shard from his chest with a sickening sound, blood splattering across Victoria's face. He wasn't even fazed. It was as though the wound had never existed. "Is that all you've got?" Carl asked, his voice laced with disgust. "Pathetic." Victoria staggered back, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She had no more strength left to fight him. She had no more hope left to cling to. It was over. But then, something inside her stirred, a spark of defiance. Victoria's mind flashed to everything she had lost. Her mother, her childhood, the life she had once known all torn apart by Carl and his twisted machinations. She thought of her father, struggling to stay alive beside her, and her heart clenched. She couldn't let this be the end. She wouldn't. Not like this. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something, a glimmer of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The pitchfork her father had used to strike Carl earlier, now abandoned on the floor. The long, rusted spikes gleamed in the dim light. With all the strength she had left, Victoria scrambled toward it, her legs barely able to support her weight. Her hand closed around the shaft of the pitchfork, and with a roar of defiance, she turned and faced Carl one final time. Carl, still holding the bloody shard of wood in his hand, took a step toward her, but this time, Victoria didn't wait. With a cry of fury, she lunged forward, the pitchfork in her hands aimed directly at his heart. Carl's eyes widened as the pitchfork pierced his chest with a sickening crunch. The force of her strike sent him staggering back, his blood spraying into the air. And for the first time, Carl screamed. The scream was like nothing Victoria had ever heard, a sound so primal, so full of agony, that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the barn. The walls trembled, and the wind outside howled as if in response. Carl staggered, his form shifting, flickering almost as though it was unraveling. The inhuman shape he had assumed began to distort and contort, his body twisting in ways that no human body ever should. His eyes, once cold and empty, were now filled with a mixture of rage and fear. Victoria didn't stop. She drove the pitchfork deeper, twisting it, her body shaking with the intensity of her fear and anger. With one final blood-curdling scream, Carl collapsed, his body disintegrating into a cloud of dark mist. The mist swirled around them, engulfing the barn in an eerie fog, but it didn't last. Slowly, it began to dissipate, leaving nothing behind but the scent of decay. Victoria stood there, panting, her body racked with exhaustion. The barn was silent now, the storm outside a distant rumble. Her hands trembled as she looked at her father, who was now slumped on the ground, barely conscious. The terror was over, but at what cost? The barn was silent now. The wind outside had subsided, leaving only the soft rustle of hay in the corners of the barn. Victoria stood in the center, her breath ragged and uneven, her body trembling as though the very act of survival had drained the last remnants of her strength. The pitchfork was still clutched in her hand, the blood of Carlo, whatever he had been dripping from the metal spikes. The air was thick with the scent of death, of decay, but also of something more, something darker, almost suffocating. She looked down at the ground, at the blood that stained the floor beneath her feet, and the eerie stillness that had settled in the barn. It should have felt like a victory. It should have felt like freedom. But as she stood there, staring at the place where Carl's twisted form had once stood, there was only emptiness. Her father, Andreas, had collapsed against a pile of hay. He was barely conscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The blood that had soaked through his clothes was a grim reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Victoria's heart ached for him, and the weight of their ordeal pressed down on her like an unrelenting fog. She staggered toward him, her legs unsteady, and knelt beside him. Her hand trembled as she gently placed it on his forehead, feeling the coolness of his skin. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he looked at her, as though unsure of where he was, unsure of what had happened. His gaze was bleary, but there was a faint spark of recognition in his eyes. "Papa," Victoria whispered, her voice hoarse. Andreas' lips parted, but no words came. He tried to lift his hand, to touch her, but his body trembled with the effort. She could see the pain etched across his face, the exhaustion, the overwhelming toll that the past days had taken on him. "It's over," Victoria said, more to herself than to him. "It's finally over." But even as she said the words, something gnawed at her. A chill ran through her body, creeping beneath her skin, making her shiver despite the warmth of the barn. The battle with Carlo, whatever Carl had been, was over, but the feeling that something was still wrong. Something that hadn't been fully resolved lingered in the air. She stood up slowly, her gaze scanning the barn once more. The walls, the hay scattered across the floor, the faint smell of burnt wood, the remnants of their struggles seemed to blend into the background, like a nightmare that refused to let go. But then, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, a soft scraping sound, barely audible over the crackling of the dying fire in the corner. Victoria froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The barn had felt empty, abandoned, but now there was someone else. Victoria's breath hitched as she turned, her eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. The barn was still. No movement, no sound. Her fingers clenched around the pitchfork again, as though it were the only thing tethering her to reality. She stepped cautiously toward the barn's entrance, her eyes darting from corner to corner. Every muscle in her body coiled, ready to spring at any moment. Then she saw it. A shadow moved across the barn door. It was quick, too quick for her to track, but there it was. Her heart raced as she stepped back, her mind screaming at her to run, to leave this place, to never look back. She wanted to ignore it, to tell herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her after everything she had endured, but the fear in her gut told her otherwise. The sound came again this time, closer, sharper. Victoria's eyes flicked toward the corner of the barn, where the darkness seemed deeper than before. And there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was not Carl ... It was something worse. The figure moved forward, its body shifting in ways that made Victoria's blood run cold. It was tall, to Toland. The way it moved was unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The face that emerged from the shadows was barely recognizable, its features distorted beyond recognition, a grotesque mockery of humanity. It had the same hollow eyes, the same twisted grin, but this creature was different. It was Carl, or what had once been Carl, but something had changed. The figure in front of her was no longer the man she had fought. It was something else entirely. It was the thing that had been lurking behind Carl's eyes. It was the darkness, the ancient evil that had been festering inside him, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had killed Carlshay, had driven the pitchfork into his chest. She had watched him die. But this was not the end. The creature's eyes locked onto hers, its grin widening unnaturally as it took another step toward her. Victoria's mind raced. She needed to think. She needed to survive. But her thoughts were disjointed, panic clawing at her chest. She raised the pitchfork, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and her feet moved backward as if on instinct. "Papa," she whispered hoarsely, but the words were lost in the silence of the barn. The figure reached out, its hand long and clawed, fingers extending like a spider's legs. Victoria's mind screamed for her to run, but she couldn't move. The fear paralyzed her. Her father was still lying there, unconscious, barely clinging to life. She had to protect him. She had to. Then the figure lunged. Victoria screamed, her body moving faster than she thought possible. She swung the pitchfork, the sharp points driving into the creature's chest, but it didn't stop. It didn't flinch. It smiled. "Victoria," the thing rasped, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You can't escape me. You never could." The creature's grip tightened on her wrist, its claws digging into her flesh. Victoria screamed again, her mind spiraling, but there was no escape. This wasn't just a fight for her life, anymore it was a fight for her very soul, with one last, desperate surge of strength. Victoria wrenched herself free from the creature's grasp and shoved the pitchfork deep into its chest once more. This time, she didn't stop. She twisted it, pushed it deeper, her hands slick with blood. The creature howled, its form writhing in agony as it seemed to melt, its body twisting and distorting into a blackened mass. Victoria fought with everything she had, knowing that this was her last chance. And then, with one final ear-splitting scream, the creature dissolved into smoke, its form disappearing into the air like a fading nightmare. The barn fell silent once more. Victoria stood there, panting, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She collapsed beside her father, her arms wrapping around him as she held him close, her tears mingling with the blood on her hands. "It's over," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. There would be no return to normalcy, no returning to the life she had once known, but they had survived, and that was enough.